The days following the incident aboard the cruise ship were filled with a deep sense of reflection. Barron and Isabella knew that the road ahead would not be easy, and yet there was an undeniable sense of peace that had settled between them. The chaos of the night, the dangerous encounter, and the emotional turbulence all felt like distant echoes now. What remained was a stronger bond, an unspoken understanding that no matter the trials they would face in the future, they would confront them together. Barron, a man used to living in the shadows of his powerful family, was beginning to understand the true nature of strength. It wasn't in distancing himself from his past or his name, it was in choosing how to move forward, no matter the weight of legacy. The actions of Captain Blackwood had been a catalyst, but Barron's true awakening came from his own internal resolve. As he stood on the deck of the ship one last time before they docked, he looked out at the vast ocean stretching infinitely ahead. It was a symbol of the unknown, of challenges and possibilities that were yet to come. The waves, unpredictable and wild, reminded him of life itself, unpredictable, at times tumultuous, but always moving forward. Barron realized that no matter how far he ran or how much he tried to hide from the past, the ocean of life would always beckon him forward. Turning to Isabella, who stood by his side, he spoke with clarity he had never known before. "I can't control the past, but I can control how I navigate the future." Isabella smiled, her gaze as steady and unwavering as his own. "And together, we'll chart the course." In that moment, they understood that their journey was far from over. What had happened on that cruise ship, the confrontation with Blackwood, the revelations about family and legacy, it had all been part of a much larger story. A story not just of survival, but of transformation. The world, Barron now knew, would continue to test him. The name Trump would continue to loom large, and the weight of expectations would never fully leave him. But there was one thing he could be sure of: he would no longer be defined by his past. His actions, his decisions, his choices, they would be what defined him. For Isabella, the experience had only reinforced her belief in the power of resilience. She had stood by Barron through the chaos, but it wasn't just loyalty that bound her to him, it was a deep understanding of his struggles and strengths. They had both been shaped by their pasts, but they knew that they could not live in the shadow of it. The future was theirs to shape, and the future, though uncertain, was filled with endless possibilities. As the cruise ship finally docked, Barron and Isabella knew that their journey was only beginning. But unlike before, they no longer feared what lay ahead. The world might be unpredictable, but they had each other. And that, above all, gave them the courage to face whatever would come next. The lessons they had learned during this experience were simple, yet profound. 1. The past may shape us, but it does not define us. 2. Strength is not in running from our history, but in choosing how we respond to it. 3. True partnership is built on trust, understanding, and resilience. 4. No matter the storm, the sun will always rise again. As they disembarked, walking side by side through the bustling port, the whispers of the past no longer held the same power. They had faced their darkest moments, and they had emerged stronger for it. The future was still unwritten, but it no longer intimidated them. Instead, they faced it with hope in their hearts and the knowledge that, together, they could conquer anything. In the end, Barron and Isabella had not only survived the storm, they had learned how to thrive in its wake. The power of transformation, of moving forward with intention and strength, was now theirs to wield. And with that, their story had just begun. The flight had barely taken off when the businessman, an abrasive figure in his mid-40s, had made his move. He was sitting just a few rows behind Keanu, his eyes scanning the cabin with a kind of superiority that only someone with money and influence could possess. The man had made a name for himself as a successful entrepreneur, but arrogance seemed to be his true currency. And now, on this first-class flight, he'd decided to use it. Keanu, as always, was calm and composed, absorbed in the view from the window. The noise of the plane seemed distant, even the murmurs of the other passengers felt muffled. He was lost in thought, as if the world outside was far more captivating than the one inside the cabin. Yet, this serenity was about to be shattered. It started innocuously enough. The businessman, in a voice that was a little too loud for the enclosed space, casually remarked, "You know, I never understood why people make such a fuss over you. I mean, all those movies where you're playing the same damn character. How do you even get away with it?" Keanu, never one to start a confrontation, simply turned his head slowly and met the businessman's gaze. His calmness alone was enough to unnerve the man. "Oh, I see," the businessman continued, growing bolder with each word. "You've got this mysterious, humble guy thing down, huh? But we all know it's just an act. Don't you think it's pathetic how people worship you just because you play a tough guy? I mean, it's all just Hollywood magic." Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, radiating a quiet intensity that caused the businessman to squirm slightly in his seat. Still, he pressed on. "And let's be honest," the businessman added with a smirk, "you've always been kind of a joke, haven't you? I mean, you're not even the best actor in your genre. You're not even the best Keanu." He laughed, pleased with himself for getting a rise. At this point, some passengers around them began to notice the exchange, sensing an undercurrent of tension. Keanu, however, simply turned back to the window, his fingers gently drumming on the armrest. The businessman's tone shifted, trying to provoke him further. "You're just a washed-up actor, Keanu. No one really cares about your movies anymore. You're a has-been." At this, Keanu finally responded. He didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge the businessman with anger. Instead, he simply turned his head again, his eyes locking with the man's. The calm in his gaze was like a force, unnerving the businessman even more. "Why do you think you need to insult someone you don't know?" Keanu's voice was quiet, but there was an undeniable strength behind it. "What do you gain from it?" The businessman blinked, a pause hanging in the air. Keanu wasn't rising to the bait, and that alone made him feel unsettled. People insult others to feel powerful. "It's a weakness, not a strength," Keanu continued. His words weren't defensive, but they carried the weight of someone who had long ago learned the power of humility. He wasn't trying to explain himself to this man. He was simply speaking the truth as he saw it. The businessman, sensing his control slipping, took a final jab. "Yeah, well, maybe I just think you're overrated. You're not as great as everyone makes you out to be." Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply nodded and said, "I can see how you'd feel that way." His response was so measured, so understanding, that it took the businessman by surprise. For a brief moment, it was as though the room itself had shifted. For the first time, the businessman felt a small knot of discomfort in his chest. Keanu, in his unassuming way, had reframed the entire conversation. It was no longer about who was right or wrong, it was about something deeper, something more uncomfortable for the businessman. As the silence stretched, the tension in the air became palpable. The other passengers were now fully aware of what was happening, and a few even glanced over with raised eyebrows. Then, without warning, the businessman's demeanor changed. He cleared his throat, sitting back in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. The words he had so eagerly hurled at Keanu now felt hollow, even childish. Keanu, still quiet, turned back to the window. The conversation was over, at least for him. But the businessman was left with an unsettling sense of reflection. As the flight continued, the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, once oblivious to the minor drama unfolding in their midst, now felt a subtle unease in the air. The businessman had no idea what to say or how to recover from the unexpected turn of events. Keanu, as always, remained composed, a figure of quiet strength amidst the chaos. What happened next would linger with the businessman far longer than he could ever have expected. It wasn't just a chance encounter, it was an opportunity for introspection. Keanu had responded not with force or arrogance, but with the kind of grace and wisdom that only someone who had truly mastered themselves could exhibit. It was this subtle but undeniable power that would stay with the businessman for the remainder of the flight, long after he'd departed the plane. The flight had entered its final hours, and the tension in the cabin had yet to fully dissipate. While the businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, attempting to bury himself in his magazine, Keanu remained as calm and unflappable as ever. His demeanor had not changed. He was the very picture of serenity, even as the other passengers whispered amongst themselves. But something had shifted in the air, a palpable energy that everyone in the vicinity could feel. The businessman's attempts to regain his sense of control only seemed to deepen his discomfort, and Keanu's calm, unwavering presence was more powerful than any verbal confrontation. The businessman had underestimated the man before him. He had assumed that Keanu was just another celebrity who could be poked and prodded for sport, someone who would react with ego or anger. But the reality was far more disorienting. Keanu had not been a passive victim, but a mirror, reflecting the businessman's insecurities and need for superiority. The businessman felt as though he were staring at a reflection that exposed his own flaws, a reflection he could not escape. "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" The businessman's voice broke the silence, an attempt at regaining some semblance of control. He had avoided Keanu's gaze for the past several minutes, but now he was determined to push the interaction to its limit. Keanu turned toward him slowly, his eyes meeting the man's once again. "Sure," Keanu replied, his voice still as measured as ever, free from any hint of irritation. "Why do you let people walk all over you?" The businessman's words were blunt, delivered with a sense of challenge. "I mean, you've made enough money. You're famous enough. You don't have to put up with the nonsense people throw at you. So why do you just take it?" The question was a pointed one, the type of challenge meant to provoke a deeper reaction, to reveal cracks in the surface. But Keanu's response was not what the businessman had expected. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze softening. "I don't let people walk all over me," Keanu began, his tone still calm but carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. "I choose how I react. You can't control what others do, but you can control how you respond. If I let every insult, every harsh word, dictate how I feel, I'd be giving away my peace. And that's not something I'm willing to do." For a moment, the businessman said nothing. His mind reeled. He had been ready for a fight, ready for Keanu to defend his ego, to stand up and assert his power. But instead, Keanu had diffused the situation with nothing more than an answer that carried the weight of wisdom. The businessman couldn't help but feel a deep sense of discomfort. Keanu's words didn't just challenge him, they made him question everything he believed about power, about strength, and about self-worth. "Isn't that a bit weak?" the businessman muttered, though there was less conviction in his voice now. "I mean, if you don't stand up for yourself, aren't you just letting people walk all over you?" Keanu smiled softly, but it wasn't a smug smile. It was the smile of someone who understood something deeper than surface-level conflict. "It's not weakness to choose peace. It's strength. The real strength comes from knowing when to walk away, when to let things go. You can spend your whole life fighting battles that don't matter, or you can focus on the things that truly matter." For a long time, the businessman didn't speak. He had no words to respond. Keanu's response had taken him by surprise, but even more than that, it had forced him to confront something about himself he had never truly examined. He had spent his entire life building walls, putting people down to make himself feel better, because he was terrified of showing vulnerability. And now, here was this man who had every reason to be defensive, every reason to fight back, but instead, he chose something far more difficult. He chose peace. It was in that moment that the businessman realized just how much he had underestimated Keanu. His words, calm and reflective, had begun to chip away at the businessman's hardened exterior, exposing a weakness that had long been buried. In a way, Keanu had won, not with force, not with words, but with something far more profound: grace. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking out the window, unable to meet Keanu's gaze again. He had no further questions, no retorts, no jabs to throw. He had come into this conversation with the intent to tear down a man he believed to be nothing more than a facade. But now, all he could feel was a deep sense of unease, and a curiosity about something greater than the surface-level bravado he had spent his life chasing. Keanu, ever the quiet observer, leaned back in his chair, his eyes returning to the view outside the window. He had said all that needed to be said, and now, the rest was up to the businessman. As the flight continued its descent, the businessman found himself reflecting on the encounter. He realized that the power he had sought his entire life, the power to control others, to manipulate situations, was fleeting. True power, it seemed, came not from dominance, but from self-control, from choosing peace in the face of adversity. Keanu had not only diffused a confrontation, he had planted the seed of change in the businessman's mind. And as the plane touched down, the businessman knew that his perspective had shifted. Whether he would act on it or not, only time would tell. The final words between them were few, but they were enough to carry the weight of this encounter for a lifetime. Keanu simply said, with a gentle smile, "I hope you find what you're looking for." And with that, the businessman was left to wonder. Had he been living a life focused on the wrong things? Had he, too, been chasing something shallow, missing the true strength in front of him all along? As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their belongings, the atmosphere was noticeably different from when they had first boarded. The businessman, once full of pride and confidence, now moved with a quiet, contemplative air. He had arrived at his destination, but the journey within had only just begun. His earlier bravado had been replaced with a deep introspection, a curiosity that had never been there before. The encounter with Keanu had shattered something inside him, something that had needed to be broken for a long time. For Keanu, the situation had unfolded in a way he had expected. He knew that the businessman's challenge wasn't personal. It was a test, a reflection of the man's own insecurities. Keanu had faced many such encounters throughout his life, and time again, he had learned that the best way to handle provocation wasn't to respond in kind, but to remain grounded in the face of chaos. His words had not been meant to teach a lesson, but to offer a perspective that the businessman had been ready to hear, whether he knew it or not. The businessman's reflection was deep, and though he may have walked off the plane with more questions than answers, there was a subtle shift within him. He had been so focused on winning, on asserting control, that he had failed to realize that true power didn't come from dominance. It came from self-awareness, from the strength to walk away from unnecessary conflict, and from the courage to confront his own flaws. The businessman had spent his life building walls to protect himself from vulnerability, but now, those walls were beginning to crumble. Keanu's example had planted a seed of change in him, and while it was impossible to predict what the businessman would do with this newfound wisdom, the seed had been sown. It was now up to him to water it, to nurture it, and to allow it to grow into something meaningful. The path to transformation was never easy, but it began with a single moment of realization, just as it had for the businessman on that flight. In the end, the lesson was simple, yet profound. True strength lies not in dominating others, but in dominating our own reactions. The power to control our responses, to choose peace over conflict, to embrace vulnerability instead of hiding behind bravado, these are the traits that truly define a person. It is easy to mistake force for power, but real power comes from understanding the deeper currents that drive us. Keanu had shown that it is not the external world that needs to be controlled, but the inner world. The businessman would leave that plane with a sense of uncertainty, but also a sense of hope. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But one thing was clear: he had been given the opportunity to change. Whether he would take it or not was entirely up to him. As the passengers exited the plane, Keanu was the last to stand. He offered a simple smile to the businessman, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken shift between them. And though their paths might never cross again, the impact of their brief exchange would stay with both of them forever. For Keanu, this was just another day in a life that had been shaped by years of learning and growing, of confronting the darkness within and choosing the light. But for the businessman, this moment would mark the beginning of his own journey towards self-discovery. He would now have to confront the things he had spent his life avoiding: his own fears, his own weaknesses, and the truth about what it meant to truly be powerful. The story between Keanu and the businessman was one of many that could be told, but what made it powerful wasn't the confrontation or the exchange of words. It was the profound impact that one person's example had on another. We all carry with us a version of that businessman, the version that wants to prove something, that fears vulnerability, that strives for control over others. But we also carry the version of Keanu, the version that has learned that true power lies in stillness, in choosing peace, in looking within before looking outside. In the end, the question remains: which version of ourselves will we choose to be? Will we continue to chase validation through force, through confrontation, and through domination? Or will we learn to harness the quiet strength that lies within us, the strength to respond with grace, to lead with kindness, and to face life's challenges with humility and self-awareness? The story of Keanu and the businessman reminds us that power isn't something we gain through external victories. It's something we cultivate within ourselves. And in that cultivation, we can begin to create a world that values understanding over judgment, peace over conflict, and love over fear. We are all capable of transformation. The question is whether we are brave enough to embrace it. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, where in your life can you choose peace over conflict? How can you cultivate strength from within? The road to personal growth may not always be easy, but it's always worth it. The power to change is in your hands, and it begins with a single, intentional step forward.